Good morning and welcome to the 11th in our series of Urban Transport Next conversations with a live online audience on topics that will help determine the future of urban transport, this time looking at urban freight. So whether you're spending your lunchtime listening live to us or whether you're listening later on the podcast or watching the playback on YouTube, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Becky Fuller. I'm Assistant Director at the Urban Transport Group, and we're the ones hosting these events. For those of us who don't know UTG, we bring together the public sector transport authorities for the UK's largest urban areas, so Transport for London, Transport for Greater Manchester, Transport for West Midlands and all the other major metros as well, serving over 20 million people. We try to think about what's next for urban transport and support our members to implement that thinking on the ground and also to learn from each other as a network. It's great to see so many of you listening out there in the audience. We've got a great event for you today, and it follows hot on the heels of our Delivering the Future freight report that we published on Monday. And I'm pleased to say that we've got the author of that report, Dr. Clare Linton, on our panel this afternoon. Clare's our policy and research advisor here at UTG, and she conducts research across a range of policy areas, but always with an eye to decarbonisation and environmental sustainability. We also have Maggie Simpson, who's Director General of the Rail Freight Group, the representative body for rail freight in the UK. And chairing today's discussion is Stephen Joseph, who spent an amazing 30 years at the helm of Campaign for Better Transport and is now a transport policy consultant, chair of the Foundation for Integrated Transport and a director of the Transport for New Homes project. You out there in the audience can also be part of this conversation in three ways. Firstly, by putting your short, sharp questions into the questions box. You can also vote for your favourite questions to push them up the list. Stephen will be picking these up in the final section of the conversation. You can also participate using the comments channel, but please don't post your questions in there because we might not spot them. And of course, you can also comment on Twitter using the hashtag UTGNext. So enjoy the event, and over to you, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Becky, and welcome everybody to this. If you're joining us live, then congratulations for joining us rather than Prime Minister's questions. I think this is such an important topic. Freight tends to get lost in a lot of transport policy debates, I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure Maggie in particular is fed up with the O and freight in transport discussions. So what we're hoping to do over the next hour is to explore aspects of freight as it affects urban areas and the city regions, and to look at what has been happening, what is happening now, and what should happen in the future. Well, look, can I start by asking both Maggie and Claire, starting with Maggie, how you got into this? How did you get into freight and well, in Maggie's case, rail freight?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today talking to you all about urban freight and how rail can support that. So I've been at the Rail Freight Group now for 2 more years than I care to think. I've been leading it since 2012, and I joined in 2005. But I first came into rail freight when the railways last had an arm's length body, the Strategic Rail Authority, and at the time that was being established, I was working in one of the organisations that formed up the SRA, working actually on passenger rail franchising at the time. And the opportunity came up to go into the freight team there to work on the first rail freight strategy. And as soon as I came to freight, I just rather fell in love with it. It's so much more interesting than passenger transport in my experience, and takes you right across the country and right across the economy too. So I've stuck with rail freight pretty much since that happened in 2000. And today, Rail Freight Group, which I lead, represents around 120 businesses, from freight train operators and customers right through to ports, quarries, terminal operators, manufacturers and supply chain businesses. So it's a real privilege for me to be involved with such an interesting and vibrant sector.
Claire, would you like to say how you got into this? Though I know freight is only one of your many interests.
It is, yeah. So I've been at UTG for nearly 6 years now, and in that time I've kind of worked across a whole range of policy areas. But as Becky was saying in the introduction there, my kind of real passion and interest is sustainability. And I think that's kind of how I've come to be interested in freight, because it's such a big part of our transport system. And I think, as Stephen said, often gets overlooked. And I think as well, we have a lot of kind of choices we can make in how we make our passenger journeys. We can think about, taking different modes but actually when we're thinking about freight as consumers, usually there's a default option and it just turns up, or, we expect things to be on the shelves. So that kind of level of choice isn't necessarily there. So I think we need to think about freight in different ways. So that's kind of how I've come to be interested in freight, particularly from the kind of decarbonisation perspective, but also kind of more broadly on how it impacts across society too.
Thanks very much. Well, I thought we'd start by seeing what's changed in freight, in particular. What's been happening, obviously, in the last few years and with COVID. What is going on? What has been going on now? Maggie, I think your industry's had a resurgence, hasn't it?
Yes, I think it's been really interesting, and just reflecting on what Clare was saying there about people's perception of freight and how it matters to them. So my colleagues at UK Major Ports Group actually this morning they've just published some public awareness surveying they've been doing about perceptions of freight across all modes actually, and it's come up with some really interesting results, including that people's appreciation of lorry drivers has increased by more than their appreciation of policemen. I don't know whether that's to do with the Met Police's investigation of Boris's party or not, but the statistic that caught my eye was that nearly half the public, 48%, agree or strongly agree with the statement, "I think more about the process by which goods are transported and delivered to me than I did a few years ago." And almost the same percentage strongly agreeing with, "I pay more attention to where things I order online come from than I used to at the start of the year." And I think what we're really seeing is that increased awareness, not just as individuals and consumers, although we are, but in policymakers, stakeholders and government, both at national and regional level. And, reports like this one from UTG are really good. And I know UTG have published reports on freight before, but I would say they've been the exception rather than the rule. And we're seeing now Transport for North are presently consulting on their freight strategy. We've seen really solid freight content in work by Midlands Connect, Transport East, the other subnationals, Scottish Government have a rail freight policy. And even, in Westminster, much more commitment to talking about freight and being engaged in the freight discussion from central government than we have ever seen before. And I think if you peel back the onions as to why that is, I think, in essence, it started from a problem. So when people found that they couldn't get the things that they wanted, and whether that was toilet rolls or petrol or more recently lateral flow tests, it starts people's understanding that normally they can get the things that they want. And of course, I think we've seen the consequences of that supply chain disruption. And obviously, sometimes it's frankly just a bit of a nuisance. You can't get the thing you want, or your parcel's delayed or whatever. But actually, when we saw the petrol pump shortages, it was really seriously impacting on people's lives. People couldn't get to appointments, to work, to schools and so on. And we've also seen that when freight fails, it has a nasty habit of turning political very quickly. So, the army was sent to drive petrol tankers. I think by the time they trained them how to do it, they didn't really need them. But it was political almost immediately, and, empty shelves bring down governments. So that impetus that we're seeing to think about freight and to pay attention to it has probably come from those supply chain glitches that we've seen. But actually, what we need to do is translate that into really positive action about better understanding and knowledge, and therefore about better planning for freight, which is, I think, what we've been lacking for many years.
And rail has seen a resurgence, is that right?
Yeah, so I think if I look, specifically at rail, if you ignored coal, which has gone for all the good reasons, then many of the other sectors were on long-term trajectories of growth. But the last couple of years have really accelerated that. And there are multiple factors in that mix. The environment and sustainability is absolutely top of the list. So, businesses are being driven not not by government commitments to 2050 necessarily, but by, boardroom pressure to become more sustainable, and, the financial markets who are now looking at where they place their investments to make sure that they're investing in sustainable companies. And we're seeing that, absolutely coming through in people's choices. We're also, that's supply chain disruption, from both Brexit and then COVID, causing people to think differently about their supply chains. I've seen, other commentators say it's not about just in time anymore, it's about just in case. So people are looking at having more resilient supply chains. That might mean using more than one mode. It's generally meaning that there's a bit more stock holding going on, some more warehousing, which often links well to a rail offer. People are changing the ports of entry that they use to and from the UK for their imports and exports, and that's perhaps, diluting some of the row towards unitised, which is helping rail freight. So all of these factors are coming together to see more people really now wanting to exploit what they do on rail. And even in traditional sectors like construction materials, the amount of construction material we're moving by rail is off the scale at the moment. And whilst big projects like HS2 are a part of that, they're far from all of that. We're seeing almost record numbers of construction trains every week, intermodal and domestic intermodal, so warehouse to warehouse within the UK as well as to and from ports. And then new models, express freight with actual real services now operating for the first time in that market as well. So it's new things, and it's more of the things that we've been doing for some customers, expanding out to a wider customer base.
Thanks very much, Claire. What do you think has changed? You did an earlier version of this report in 2015, I think. What's changed coming back to this for the city regions and freight?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so we first published Delivering the Future in 2015, as Stephen said there, and I think lots of the points Maggie was making there are things, we would reflect on as changes in that period. But, that was kind of a big part of the impetus for coming back to the report at this time, was reflecting on these changes. So I think, greater recognition of the climate crisis, sustainability has become an ever more important part of the kind of transport agenda, and freight as part of that. And, if we think about 2015, we had a carbon reduction target of 80% by 2050. That's now a net zero target at a national level. So we've seen that shift, and ever more city regions and cities declaring a climate emergency and setting really ambitious net zero targets. So kind of freight needs to be a part of that if we're going to hit those targets. And we talk a lot about what we need in the report to kind of hit those targets, including things sort of modal shift to more rail and water freight, but also thinking about how we decarbonise our road freight, because we are always going to need some element of road freight as part of that system. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic has had, transformative changes on the ways we live and work and consume, and I think that's kind of impacted on freight. So, e-commerce was growing, far before the start of the pandemic, but has only been kind of accelerated through that. And as Maggie mentioned there, you were kind of seeing express rail freight services running to kind of meet some of that e-commerce need now as well, which is a really interesting kind of new sort of growing innovation in the sector. So I'd be interested to hear a bit more about some of those trials and pilots in a bit from Maggie. And then I think the two other things I would say is obviously we left the European Union, which has kind of had an impact on how goods move in and out of the country, but also kind of on the workforce. We saw driver shortages last year and the impact of that. And, that again was not entirely due to Brexit. We have an aging workforce in the freight sector, and that's having impacts across the sector. And it was difficult to attract drivers before that, and we saw less tests taking place, driver tests taking place during the pandemic. So, it's a multitude of factors, but Brexit has played a part in kind of what we're seeing in freight now. And then I think one of the other kind of major changes is kind of how we think about technology. I think we've seen a growth in attention on things like autonomous vehicles and drones and how we use data in freight and kind of optimizing delivery routes, those kind of things, and on kind of how linking back to the workforce, we employ people, so we've seen an increase in the gig economy, and how that's maybe more on the van side than the HGV side, but that's changed how we employ people in the freight sector. So we think about Deliveroo and how people get their takeaways, all of these kind of things that have been changed by technology, I think, largely over the last kind of decade, 5 to 10 years, really. So I think the sector's seen a huge amount of change over recent years, and I don't think it's stopping either. I think this change is still kind of underway and happening, and will continue to kind of transform the sector in the coming years as well.
I think you also said to me when we were talking about this, there's the text being applied to curbside management, where there are clearly, freight is one of the uses of the curbside in city streets. Do you want to say a bit more about that? Because that does come through from your report. Yeah,
I think so. We see ever increasing demands on the curbside, and we want to improve facilities for walking and cycling, and we see shared mobility in terms of kind of pick up and drop off. We want bike share on the streets, we want e-scooters on the streets, we want EV charging, and all of these things are putting demands on our street space. So kind of how we manage that is really important. And I think there's been various studies and kind of experiments around kind of dynamic management of the curb using new technology. So you might increase space for walking and cycling in the peak, so that people can get into work, and then you might have more space for deliveries and drop-offs at other times of day, but you can use kind of digital technologies to manage that. So I think that's an interesting and space which is kind of growing in attention. And I think it also links into something which we'll maybe pick up a bit more, but around kind of how we plan for freight and thinking ahead and making sure that it's not an afterthought. So you plan a new development and then you're like, oh, how are we going to service this development, where our delivery is going to be made to? Making sure you integrate that from the beginning is really important, I think.
Thanks. Do you want to say a bit more about some of the case studies and the changes that you found in the report? Because one of the things I noticed from looking at it was just the sheer amount of innovation and experimentation going on in this sector, particularly in relation to local freight deliveries. And actually, Maggie has also referred to things like express freight as new forms of rail freight as well. So maybe start with Clare, but Maggie might want to say something about this too, about what's changing now. What are the things that are coming on that are happening?
Sure, yeah. Well, maybe I'll talk about a couple of my favourites and more focus on the kind of local stuff and the water stuff, and then Maggie can come in on all the great stuff that's happening on rail, because I know she'll know more about those case studies than I do. So thinking about kind of local deliveries, one of the things I'm really interested in is kind of this idea of portering, which is thinking about how we do more of the last mile, or sometimes I think about it in walking terms, the last 200 metres of a delivery on foot. So I think GNU Cargo and Ford did a pilot study in London, and they focus on a dense urban core because you kind of need that density to do the kind of deliveries on foot. And they looked at how they could use a single van doing like drop-offs with 4 porters doing the kind of last 200 metres of that delivery on foot. And they use kind of data and technology to look at the optimal drop-offs for those based on the packages they had to deliver. And they found that this one van, and it was 5 porters, could achieve the same as 5 vans in a dense city centre. So they were kind of saving fuel and efficiency. And actually, one of the things I think is really interesting about that is potentially you're encouraging a more active job in a job that has historically been very sedentary and potentially has quite a lot of health consequences by being a very sedentary job, sitting in fumes. It can be quite a kind of, there's a lot of health risk associated with that job, and you're transforming it to be a much more active job, so it's a much healthier role. So I think that's a really interesting case study that could be really interesting, and would be very much focused on an urban core, but if we want to see less vehicles in our city centres, it has the potential to kind of deliver that. And then one of my other really favourite case studies from the report is Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation in central London, and they established a consolidation hub at Dartford in 2019 to try and reduce the number of vehicles coming into central London to service those hospitals. So before the hub opened, they had 160 deliveries a day to their central London sites. And using the hub has reduced truck trips in by 90%. And they found that it's removed 36,000 truck deliveries from central London every year, which is just huge. I was astounded by that. And then in 2021, they launched a pilot to use riverboat services to bring in some of those supplies from that Dartford hub into the hospitals in central London. And then they use e-cargo bikes to do the last mile bit from the riverboat to the hospitals. So that's just an initial pilot, but that's kind of hoping to kind of mitigate some of the remaining 10% of truck trips that they're still getting into the city centre. And they're also looking at whether they can introduce some electric trucks to pick up those remaining trips that they can't quite yet do via kind of the consolidation or the riverboat. So, yeah, I think it's a really, really ambitious scheme. And, you know, it's part of their ambitious climate emission reduction targets to kind of try and reduce their transport impact. So, yeah, I was really impressed by that. And I was really impressed at the kind of the broad thinking and how they've used consolidation. They've got the riverboat services, e-cargo bikes, and now they're thinking about electric trucks for that last remaining bit of road freight deliveries that they've still got. So yeah, I thought it was really, really ambitious and interesting case study there.
Thanks. Maggie, what do you think is changing now? What innovation are you seeing? You've mentioned express parcels and express freight. Are you seeing other kinds of innovation in your sector and more broadly?
Yes, I think, you know, if I think about the urban context, it's important to remember we do different kinds of freight transport. And when we think about freight transport, you know, it's right and proper that we think about those last miles. But, you know, cities use lots and lots of different consumables. So let me give you an example from a couple of years ago in London. Around the back of the Battersea Power Station redevelopment, around near the luxury flats, is the busiest construction railhead in Europe, I think. It's effectively been building those flats by bringing in its goods by rail, and they innovated in, it's a tiny, tiny little strip of land, very constrained, and they innovated in something which is not what you think of when you think of innovation, because it's a massive, great piece of handling equipment. They call it a super grab. But by deploying that super grab, they managed to increase the amount that they could handle through that terminal so that all the inbound product came in on train. It was already quite a high number, but that moved them up to all their inbound deliveries of those construction materials coming in by rail. So that's innovation at the kind of big and dirty end of the scale, if you like, in terms of those essential construction terminals. In terms of the express freight, we've got now the first trial service for Orion, working for Royal Mail, operating on the West Coast since the back end of last year. That's using a converted passenger unit. You know, they've done some trials into Euston last year, so many of you will have seen photographs of that actually happening. So that is now up and running. That links obviously to Royal Mail building a brand new rail-linked distribution centre in Daventry on the rail terminal there. That is in construction right now and will, you know, help them be much more active on rail than they have been. And then, the other part of that, using parcels on passenger trains, that's something that's been happening for a decade or more now, but in the last 12 months, we've seen a real sort of escalation of that, with cross-country buying into that network and some really innovative trials for one or two of the parcel carriers in that space as well happening at the back end of last year. So actually getting away from only the kind of slightly niche essential products that were being moved, sort of biomedical and products like that, but into the parcels market, some trials happening with that as well. So I think, there's a lot to go at, and what we're seeing is real impetus from people like Network Rail now to make sure that they're playing their part in getting those services functioning and running into, whether that's, city centre terminals or edge of town destinations. And I think we can expect to see more of that this year.
That's really interesting. I just wondered, I wanted to move on to talk about what should happen. What are the things that we want to move, that should make freight, particularly in city regions, work better. As a bridge to that, Claire, maybe you want to say, well, both of you might want to say something about the local authority role in this. Claire, your report talks about particular case studies of where the local authority have taken a kind of lead role in changing local freight. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about that, about where local authorities can play. And do local authorities, I notice a comment in the Q&A about do local authority officers and councillors have the right awareness and skills to pick up on this?
Yeah, so I think local authorities can play a really important role in freight. They understand the local context in ways that, maybe central government don't, and it enables them to kind of ensure that you kind of any changes are helping to deliver wider policy objectives as well. So when we going back to talking about, wanting our city centres to have maybe fewer cars or fewer vehicles, how do you think about that and ensure that you're not affecting kind of freight operations and that kind of thing. So I think they play a really important role in thinking across the piece on kind of urban transport policy and that kind of perspective. I also think they can play a really important role in kind of knowing the local stakeholders and bringing them together and encouraging kind of partnership working across different stakeholders at a local level. That said, we all know that local authorities have been increasingly resource constrained over recent years, and having the capacity to deliver across all of this urban transport policy is really challenging. So yeah, I think they're somewhat constrained in having the internal resource and capacity to kind of build on that effectively. But I think there's some really good stuff going on. So you mentioned there's some case studies in the report about, local authorities that are doing good things. So Nottingham City Council have got one of the most ambitious carbon reduction targets of anywhere in the UK. I think they've probably got the most ambitious. So they're aiming to be carbon neutral by 2028. And as part of trying to achieve that ambition, they have been really focused on their own fleet of vehicles. So they've now got 140 fully electric vehicles in their own council fleets, including in 2019, they got the first battery electric cage tippers, which were collecting waste from the city centre. So they're kind of putting it into operation in the city centre and really, putting zero emission freight vehicles into the city. And then in 2020, they got two electric refuse collection trucks as well. So I think they were the first, both the battery electric cage tippers and the refuse collection trucks were the first of their kind in the UK. And the refuse collection trucks are reducing carbon emissions by 52 tonnes a year each, and saving council taxpayers £32,000 a year compared to their diesel equivalents. So, they're paying their way, they're reducing carbon and paying their way in kind of the decarbonisation of refuse collection in Nottingham. And I think it's also really important to remember that kind of waste collection is a really important part of freight as well. And sometimes that gets forgotten even by me. We think of deliveries and getting all our deliveries and our goods, but actually the stuff going the other way is just as important. And then I'll just mention Leeds as well. So they, again, are trying to work on their own fleet. So they're aiming to have a zero or ultra low emission vehicle fleet by 2025, and they've now got 300 EVs. But I think one of the really interesting parts of their work is they've got 44 EVs available to local businesses in the public sector to try. So that launched in September 2020, and so over 100 organisations have taken part. 7% have gone on to buy or lease an EV, and 47% are looking to do so. And it was really interesting because one of the local breweries that I really like borrowed an electric van last year, and they were posting on Twitter about how much they loved it and how they were working out if they could get one for their own fleet. And I saw it drive past the other day. I saw them drive past an electric van, and I was really excited. I was like, I'm so glad they've gone for it. So yeah, I can order beer from my local brewery now and know it's delivered in their electric van.
Maggie, what would you like to see local authorities do?
Yes,
perhaps extend that to the subnational bodies as well, actually, since you mentioned Transport for the North. Sure.
I mean, Claire made a really good point early on, which is that one of one of the things we have to do, and one of the things that actually really isn't done at all well, is plan for how we want freight to be delivered. And by that, I don't mean having aspirations for, a targets for decarbonisation are great, but that's not the same as planning for freight. And there's a beautiful example in the report about a public realm improvement that put down lovely paving, and then everybody was really annoyed when it got smashed up by HGVs doing deliveries. And I look at that and I think, well, that was obvious, wasn't it? If you hadn't planned for how those shops and businesses were going to get their fulfillment, then inevitably your lovely paving was going to be smashed up by HGV. So why didn't you think of that in the first place before you invested in the paving? And that's a really micro example of failing to plan for freight, but we see it all over. And the Centre for London have just done a report last year about the lack of industrial land in London. And I think, without wishing to sell somebody else's webinar, they've got a webinar coming up about that, because it's a real challenge now in London, because there is so little industrial land. The land value for it is rising significantly. And of course, industrial land is everything from, small businesses who might be coffee roasters, but it might also be waste processing, or it might be, the kind of hub where you want to charge your electric vehicle, or a whole host of other things. And, when I talked to people in there, they found over the years that because a combination of planning, zoning, land value and pressure for house building, that the land on which they can occupy and do freight has been eroded, and that pushes people outside of cities. So more warehousing is now done on the periphery of cities, and that means that you effectively have then to use an HGV to get into the city. And, for us in rail freight, there's real pressure on those urban construction terminals that we have. There's one in Woking that's a bit of a cause célèbre at the moment, where the local council has, passed motions to ask Network Rail to kindly move this monstrosity out of the city, because they want to build houses without any recognition that in order to build houses, they're going to need some construction materials. And if they can't come in on a train, they're going to come in on an HGV. So there's a real disconnect here between the aspirations that people have for freight to be delivered, A, at all, and B, in a more sustainable or different way, and the planning framework, both from actual land use planning right through to the strategies that we deploy. They don't connect. And we have to do that, because I think rail freight, road freight, all freight is a private sector endeavour. It's competitive, and people will work to meet the demands that are placed on them. And those demands come ultimately from their customers. And if we want people to do things differently, and we do, and the freight providers want to meet the aspirations of those cities as well, but they can't do that if there isn't the power or the space or the land available to them to make those changes. And we've got to connect that up properly, because at the moment we just see things which are contentious a lot of the time. I think the other point just to make on that is that it's an interface point between local, regional, national, and actually global in many cases. So if we take a decision, and we see that in things like the ultra-low emission zone in London, which is a road freight thing, but if we've got different standards for how lorries should be designed and built in different cities within the same country, it's not going to work. Because all it does is it bounces the more polluting lorries out of London and sends them somewhere else. So we need to be managing those local and regional ambitions, which do drive up standards, but we need to be coordinated about that so that the market can respond in a way that's cost effective. Because if it's not cost effective, ultimately it ends up on the consumer. It adds to the cost of living crisis if we increase the cost of moving freight.
That's a really interesting, as I say, bridge into kind of where we should go next on freight. I noticed, by the way, I think Helen Miller has put in the chat that Leeds has safeguarded its canal walls and railway sidings through the planning system to protect the opportunity for non-road-based freight. And I imagine that's the sort of thing you'd like more authorities to be doing, Maggie.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for us, it is about the protection of those land sites. It's also about inappropriate adjacent development. So if you've got an activity, whether it's warehousing or waste handling or aggregates, or some of these activities are inherently maybe a bit noisy, and so if you then surround them by flats, you end up in a no-win situation for everyone. So it's about the protection and the zoning, in effect, of what you can do. And, what I see in my members is that because they are often having to, chase planning, objective planning, their sort of security of tenure isn't there. So the investments that they might be able to make in screening or, new technologies and that are harder to make because they don't necessarily think that they're going to be there in 10 years' time, because they think that they'll be CPO'd or the land will be taken away from them. So not only is it a problem for having those activities in the city, it also stops people doing the right thing sometimes as well.
Ed, you mentioned the planning issue in your report, but it sounds like that's a really important issue as one of the key things that needs to happen in the future.
Yeah, and just a few reflections on, all the great points Maggie was making there. But I think it was interesting, the point about kind of being pushed further out of the urban core when you kind of don't protect that land in the centre. And if we want to shift to more zero emission vehicles and cargo cycle deliveries, at the moment our zero emission vehicles are range constrained, and they're getting better all the time. But if your depot is pushed further and further out of the city, then your ability to kind of do those trips with those lower emission modes is maybe restricted somewhat. So I think it's really important to think about those things in our planning processes. And I think it's really important.
We're starting to get some good questions in, so I want to leave some time for those. Just finally, what are the things that you think? What are the other things that you think should change? What are the things that you've highlighted in your report that you'd really like to see changed in this? So
we've talked a bit there about kind of investing in infrastructure and for modal shift. So I won't go back too much into that, but sort of making sure that we protect the land that we need for that, and in protecting wharfs, that kind of thing, so that we can ensure that we can deliver as much as possible by rail and water. And then I think in terms of road freight, we really need a clear pathway for how we're going to decarbonise HGVs. We kind of know what's coming on lighter goods vehicles, but in terms of heavy goods vehicles, we've got this date in the future, but no really clear pathway of what the kind of roadmap looks like from here to there. There's still kind of a lot of debate about what fuels we need to go with, and that kind of inhibits people's ability to make those decisions to invest in those vehicles. So I think we need leadership from central government on kind of what the pathway is going to look like for decarbonising heavy goods vehicles in particular. And I think as well for light goods vehicles too, we need kind of serious investment in the kind of fueling and charging infrastructure for those vehicles as well, because we're not there on that. And then I think one thing we've touched on yet, but is a really important part of kind of the freight picture and is a really kind of big theme in our report, is safety. So in terms of road freight in particular, it has a really big role to play in road safety. Goods vehicles are involved in a disproportionate number of fatal and serious collisions on our roads, and particularly in urban areas where they're kind of coming into more contact with pedestrians and cyclists and other road users. It can be particularly dangerous. So a study from TfL showed that HGVs are involved in 63% of fatal collisions with cyclists and 35% of fatal collisions with pedestrians in London, despite only making up 4% of mileage. So we're still seeing a really, really big role of goods vehicles in kind of road safety concerns. So we think we need kind of more leadership on kind of road safety, kind of some sort of review of the road safety regime with a recognition of the role of goods vehicles in road safety concerns, and really to look at kind of what the world leading standards are. So we have kind of, there's different models, but the safe system approach kind of looks at it in the whole and make sure that collisions are investigated so we can learn from them. So I think we need to think, kind of just take a step back and look at kind of road safety and the role of goods vehicles in that, and how we can kind of make improvements there.
Maggie, what's on your wish list? What would you like to see changed?
So right now, planning reform is absolutely critical, I think, because it feels to me that it's hampering so much of an inability for people to plan for the kind of freight distribution they want, and for providers to make the investments they need to make. It would be a win-win for both people if we could make some progress on that. But I think Claire's absolutely right about decarbonisation. The same is a little bit true in rail freight as well. I mean, sometimes, for those of you of a certain age, you'll remember I characterise it as computer says no. So you ask government, would you mind electrifying? And they go, no, can't afford it. And you go, well, could we have some HVO? And they say, no, it's safe for the airlines. And you'd say, well, what about hydrogen? They go, well, we might want to put it in the domestic gas networks. And, is there enough lithium in the world for the batteries? Not sure, really. Oh, it's all a bit in Bolivia. And so we've got some legally binding targets set by government. That's a good thing. It's absolutely the right thing to do. But they've been set by government. But actually, all the pathways that you'd have to invest to meet that are being closed off to you. And that doesn't mean you can't do things, absolutely. Every single ton of carbon that we save is a good thing. And sometimes, we focus very much on that 2050 date and forget that we could be doing something tomorrow. So, amongst my members, I'm trying very much to say, okay, now, yes, it's really complicated and difficult and we don't know what the answer is. And probably actually the answer won't be found in the UK rail freight network. It'll be found by global R&D and development in potentially other sectors. But what could we do tomorrow? So, not stopping trains in loops all the time, smooth paths on the network for freight trains, longer freight trains, which can save disproportionately more carbon every load you put on the back. So, across London now, Network Rail is working on something called Target 26. So my members Network Rail are going, well, can we get every terminal up to the position where it can take as a minimum 20 wagons and as a target 26 wagons? Because we know it's a much better use of capacity, but actually that it's more carbon efficient. So what's that gain as well? But that long-term challenge is absolutely there, and we do need some guidance on it.
So coming to the questions, and a good segue into this, actually, somebody's asked, do we know whether GB railways will help rail freight grow? What would you like GBR to be doing when that gets up and running on rail freight? The Williams-Shapps report says that's an important area. They're going to have targets for increasing rail freight. The Scottish government's already got those, I think. What would you like GBR to be doing?
Yes, I mean, GBR, I have set out with a very strong intention to do freight better than it has been done in the past. And, Network Rail today are doing freight better than they've done it in the past as well. So there is a lot of optimism about that. I think, it's also important to remember that GBR will own and operate the passenger trains. So I think that there are some challenges around their focus as that becomes a reality. But what is it that they can do? So obviously there are things around capacity and pass on the network, that that efficiency of pass that we've just talked about. They are the freeholder of quite a high proportion of those urban terminals I've talked about, particularly the construction terminals. So I think they've got a really important role, and they are genuinely really good at that sort of interface with the planning bodies around those land sites. But are we exploiting them as well as we could? Could we do more? How do we develop them to be really useful urban hubs? Can we make a construction terminal also handle as a freight, etc., etc.? So there's some clever thinking around that land estate that I think we'd like to see. And then there's all kinds of boring and techie bits about the mechanism of the railway around charges and how we operate it. And of course, it's important that we get that right, because if rail freight isn't affordable compared to road freight, that then we're challenged on that modal shift question. So some of those techie bits are really important as well. But at the heart of it, Stephen, I think you're right. We need that sort of freight as a core of what we do. Network Rail's been putting passengers first for the last 5 years, and we need to change that so that actually what they do responds to freight just as much as it responds to passenger in their thinking. In
relation to that, I wanted to I know this will be of interest to some of the UTG members, including some I noticed in the participants list. How do you think we resolve potential conflicts where city regions want their local passenger services to grow and the desire to have more freight on rail? How do you think we manage that? Do you think that those can be consistent and work together?
Well, I mean, I think they have to be, don't they? Because both ambitions are true, and we want to grow the railways for the good of the economy and the environment. So we have to find a way of making it true, and that does require some compromise. I think it's really important that people understand that, going back to where we started, that when they got a parcel today, yes, that van was local, but it came from a warehouse that was national, that came off a ship that was global. So that you can't put a boundary around us thinking about freight at a local or a city region level. So some of those freight trains that come through your city region that don't stop are ridiculously annoying, but actually, yes, they're going into a warehouse to offload some goods that they then later get back on an electric van, maybe. Well, is that annoying? It shouldn't be annoying to you. And actually, perhaps it's going through your region and going into a warehouse and delivering stuff to people in a different region, but is that okay? Because we all live in a society together. So I think we just have to be mature about this and understand that it is a global network of distribution that ends up playing out on the local level and finding the ways to do that. And I think in terms of capacity on the network, it's a difficult thing, but we have to, I think, innovate a bit more. There's more technology that we could deploy around traffic management, network planning, network rails timetabling strategy that I think will help us to exploit that capacity, even in a world where perhaps we don't have as much money for pouring concrete as we might like. So we have to find a way through it, don't we?
Claire, there's been a number of questions in the chat about things like about urban deliveries. Julian Worth has said, well, clearly 44-ton articulated vehicles are inappropriate for urban deliveries, but if you have smaller vehicles, that means more trips for a given volume of freight. Where's the optimum balance? Are we talking 20 to 30 ton battery rigid trucks? Somebody else has asked about cargo bikes. Do you have a view about because you've talked passionately about decarbonising the remaining road freight in urban areas. Do you have a view about where that takes us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky, and largely operators are going to use the most efficient option because it makes sense for them financially. But I think we've touched a little bit, but not explicitly, on kind of consolidation and making the best use of the space in vehicles that are coming in. So it's a really tricky and challenging area, and I think it's been, constrained in some ways by commercial interest because different operators are operating their own deliveries and don't necessarily want to share commercial data or work together on this, but it offers an opportunity to make more efficient use of the vehicles that are coming into our cities. So yeah, I think in terms of exactly what the right size of vehicles is, it's not always clear, is it? If it's one 44-ton truck versus 50 vans, then potentially you're that is the more efficient option. But it's putting the right kind of environment in place for those vehicles to operate safely and efficiently. So again, comes back to the planning point that if you need those vehicles to be coming into a certain space, then making sure that you've got the right kind of infrastructure for them. If you don't want them to come into a certain space, planning for how you kind of keep them out, but what you do instead, and thinking it through strategically. We've seen huge growth in van traffic in the last 20 years. We did a separate report a few years ago focused specifically on the growth in van traffic. It's not a simple, well, let's use more vans and ditch the bigger HGVs. I think it's extremely complicated, isn't it? But where there are opportunities to use smaller, low or zero emission vehicles, more cargo bikes where appropriate, I think we should incentivize and take every opportunity we can. And I think coming back to this point around shifting more to rail and water, where we can make sure we've got the urban cities and the facilities in the urban core for those deliveries to come in as far as they can on rail and water, that then makes it easier to shift those onto lower and zero emission modes, smaller vehicles, when they get into the urban core, because we've got them in further. So we've got those kind of, we can run the electric vans or the cargo bikes from those vehicles when they're getting into the cities.
And I think Claire makes a point about people doing things because it's financially efficient for them to do so. And, I come back to my point that therefore means that the consumer gets a lower price because, in a commercial market with pretty thin margins right across freight and logistics, that obviously is not completely linear, but there is a link between the cost that you incur and the price that you pass on. So we have to think about pricing as well. And, in a world where, will the Treasury ever cough on road pricing? I don't know, but Sadiq Khan thinks he's going to go first. So we have to think about how we do that in a way that incentivises the kind of freight that we want, rather than putting in something which is about, a different objective and then ending up with some perversities around the way that freight's priced. So if we don't get that right, we end up adding more pressure on consumer prices. So we have to make the things that today would cost more end up costing less by the way we price them. And I don't know what the answer is. It's ridiculously complicated. I get that. But just relentlessly driving up the price of freight by restricting its hours or making it handled more often or doing other things to it will end up in prices. And we can make it more effective by depricing the things that we want people to do, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say that, because I think it's interesting how, like, the default with a delivery is free delivery over £50, say, and it will come in 2 days, but you can pay more for next day. But I always wonder why, if I could get like a discount, or it'd be cheaper to get something in a week or 2 weeks. If I don't need it tomorrow, then why can't I pay less to have it in a longer period of time? I ordered something on Monday and it turned up yesterday, and I was like, I didn't need this. Like, I didn't need this to come so quickly. It could have come next week and I would have been just as happy. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's that, like you say, incentivizing the things we want people to do, which could be, actually, I don't need this for a bit, so it can come whenever there's a van coming my way.
Graham North, who's the North Yorkshire and City of York Rail officer, has asked an interesting question, which I think relates to some of this, which is, how do we get past commercial confidentiality issues among freight operators? I guess that affects rail and road. And in relation, I think, to doing some of the sharing and increasing the overall efficiency of the operation of goods vehicles, but also potentially of rail freight.
So I think it depends why you're asking the question. Because, I mean, it's a myth to say that it doesn't happen today. People collaborate, particularly in rail all the time, because, the majority of intermodal trains are multi-customer. But, within road freight, then vehicles are, routinely shared between different businesses. It may be that, one bread factory doesn't want to collaborate with another bread factory, but, it'll move something else. And, the Tesco train comes south from Scotland with all sorts of stuff on it, including chipboard and a whole load of other products. So that collaboration is out there. Commercial businesses are doing it. You have to understand where and why they're not going to do that. And, of course, remember that competition law actually prohibits quite a lot of it. So there is that. But I think there's also a question there, which I see quite a lot, which is people go, I can't do freight because I haven't got any data. And therefore I can't plan for freight because I haven't got any data. So what we need to do is have data. And I think it comes from a mindset of public transport where, if you want to know what colour shoes your commuters are using on the tram network, you're in control of that. You can go out and survey it, whatever. And it is a different mindset. And I would say you can plan for freight with some quite macro level data. And we have to really think about what it is, the data that we really want, because a lot of data that there is commercial for good reason, and in some cases because the law says it has to be. So what do we really need to know to be able to plan freight better? Let's focus in on that data and see how we can get that data, and whether that's through GPS or survey or whatever else. And then in terms of that collaboration, we should put in place the sort of marketplaces that cause people to want to have the conversations that they already have elsewhere around doing that collaboration between business.
Graham has clarified that he was talking about light parcels traffic on passenger trains, where he thinks the commercial confidentiality issue might get in the way. That sounds like a discussion to be taken offline, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware that it is. I think, you know, there's more of a challenge around, which is coming around the passenger train operators seeing it as a market they want to be involved in.
Yeah,
but I think that's coming.
Somebody has asked an interesting question about, has the panel taken into account the online shift? It's particularly by 2028, over 50% of shopping will be online, driven by demographics. I think you both sort of reflected that. Maggie, how well do you think the rail freight industry is placed to be part of a predominantly online shopping world?
So I think, you know, online isn't a miracle. You know, you still have to import goods into the country or produce them in the country, and you have to put them in a warehouse somewhere. And I think what you see in online actually is those things are then warehoused rather more than being in a, you know, in the olden days, you'd go into a shop and they'd go in the stock room and get something for you, wouldn't they? And now they don't have a stock room anymore. They probably have a smaller unit, and if it's not in store, you order it online when you get home. So we've sort of shifted storeroom to warehouse, and rail freight's in a really good place to play in that market, because we're seeing, you know, new strategic rail freight interchanges putting those warehouses on the railheads, which means that those they can take advantage of rail much more easily because it's right next door to them, you know, literally on the same site. And where those developments going in now at places like iPort in Doncaster and East Midlands Gateway, we're seeing a huge uptake of rail. You know, East Midlands Gateway had its official opening just before the pandemic. It's already got 5 daily trains with plans for others, you know, across the course of this year. So those warehouse occupiers are using rail there. So that's kind of taking on board the inbound, and, you know, we can see opportunities for doing more of the sort of next stage of distribution, which is warehouse to warehouse. When we get into that sort of, you know, direct to consumer piece, that's where freight on passenger trains and urban logistics, the sort of Orion parcel traffic come into play. But again, I think, you know, we have a huge role on that trunk haul, which is almost easy. You know, it's where it's air freighted or double deck trailered today. We can do that by rail easily. Then we've got to unlock how we want those deliveries to be done in the local region and how rail can best play into that.
We're coming up to the end of this. Clare, would you like to say what you'd like to see happening next? You know, what, you know, do you have some final comments that you'd like to make about where your report will go next and what you'd like to see happen?
Yeah, so I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I think we picked up on lots of stuff kind of from the report, but also kind of outside of that as well. And I've really enjoyed hearing from Maggie about what's happening in the.
Sorry, I should interrupt by Michael Whitaker has asked a really interesting quick wins question that you'd like to nominate. He's mentioned planning standards, but do you have other quick wins you'd like to see as well?
I guess one that I think that is not necessarily a quick win, but would win across a lot of kind of our urban policy objectives, is thinking about kind of how we use road and street space. So, you know, if we invest in walking and cycling infrastructure, then that could incentivize more e-cargo bike deliveries or more people delivering on foot. And you know, as we start to kind of manage traffic, thinking about using smaller and low emission vehicles. So I guess it's not necessarily a quick win, but what I was going to say is like what I really hope is that freight can play kind of its role in thriving, green, livable, people-centric places. And I think if we kind of plan from that perspective, then we can deliver the cities we want and, make sure that our goods get to where they need to, effectively and efficiently. So that's kind of what I hope, that we can kind of have freight as part of our strategic vision for our cities and not an afterthought, as we sort of said at the start. Like, we don't want it to be the afterthought. We want it to be part of that kind of really ambitious vision for like decarbonised city regions.
Thanks very much. I think we've just about reached the end of our time. Sorry, Maggie, I would like to ask you about quick wins. I'd like to thank both Clare and Maggie for what they've said, and to all the people who put in questions and chats. We got to most of them. We didn't get to canals. Sorry about that. And I'd like to hand back to Becky. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Clare and Maggie. What a fantastic conversation. I think what came out strongly for me is that the net zero challenge is going to force us to come up with more imaginative freight solutions. I love the portering idea. I love the Guy's and St Thomas example of combining consolidation, riverboats, cargo bikes. That diversity of methods can only help improve the resilience of our networks. And as Maggie said, if we're going to do that, we need to plan for the networks we want and safeguard that land, that curb space and that infrastructure that we need. If you haven't already done so, pop over to our website, take a look at our Delivering the Future report, and keep an eye out for details of our future Urban Transport Next events coming soon. Thanks again to our panel and to everyone who took part live, listened in or watched back. Thank you and goodbye.